Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to do a test. I'm going to test Bing Chat, which is another generative AI program. And I'm going to try and test if it's able to help me create a syllabus for a course. Now, what I've done is I've got some notes here that I've taken in a meeting that I had with a colleague, just bouncing around different ideas about a course on comics and culture and criminology in the context of criminology. So let me share my screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to actually type out my notes, but what I'm going to try and do is two things. It's a test of the power of Bing Chat or ChatGPT or generative AI in helping reform or edit or shape ideas. And I'm also going to test this idea of just kind of stream of consciousness, reading out my notes through Microsoft Word. I have Microsoft Word here open in Microsoft Teams, and I'm just going to use the dictate function over here. So I'm going to just, in no real order, read out my notes from a meeting to brainstorm ideas for a possible course. And I think it will unfold. The logic of this will unfold. So I'm going to dictate. So we had a meeting to talk about a cultural criminology course, one that focused on comics or comic books. And some of the ideas that we thought about in relationship to having a course about comics was that we thought that a comic course in a department of criminology should have some type of historical component where there's a discussion of the historicity or the history, if you will, of comics, meaning talking about the early period, the middle period, and the more contemporary period. We also decided that a comic course could also talk about genres, different types of genres of books, romance books, superhero books, comedy comics, children's comics, so on and so forth, different types of genres. We also realized that, there's quite a difference between comic books in North America versus comic books in Europe, and then certainly comic books versus Asia, so in China or Japan, or manga, or kung fu comics in the context of China. Very different than the superhero comics and the underground comics that developed in North America, and very different than the bande dessinée comic culture in France or in Paris in general, from the from the post-war period onward. So we thought that a course could also focus on that aspect. We also thought that there should be a component of political economy, one that talks a bit about the business or the production of comic books and its if you will, section and interlocking with different social political issues. We also thought that a comic book course should also deal with regulation, the regulation of comic books, the criminalization of comic books, the deviance and, if you will, normalcy that was attached or not attached to comics and the history of comics. There's also the question of prohibition and the issue about how certain books were perceived to be deviant or perhaps in some cases pornographic or morally, if you will, suspect. We also thought that there could be a focus on, in the context of Asian books and also North American books as well, anime. So the explosion of anime in the field of comics was something that also we thought could be touched upon in a course about comics. Perhaps the culture of collectibles as well. That's a more contemporary, if you will, phenomena of collectibles. There's a new phenomena of conventions, of comic conventions as well, and celebrities. We also thought that there could be a section, or if you will, a treatment of underground comics and the development of underground comics. I think we talked about already, I mentioned this question of regulation, because there was the fear that comics were morally, if you will, corrupting, that there was a kind of moral panic or hysteria, especially during the Comics Code period in the American context, connected with drug use and reefer madness and that type of, if you will, panic. Then, of course, we thought, there is also just this genre that's been so important to comics, which is superheroes. So there should be probably a deep focus on superhero comics, and also another focus on underground comics, because the underground comics, as was developed in the American context, is so important to, I think, how we understand non-superhero comics, right? We also thought of this question of realism, certain types of realist comics, or even documentary type comics. There's a whole history of that as well that should be discussed. And then a more contemporary issue that we touched upon was this question of digitization, and, if you will, computers, and the evolving technology of comic book art and inking and coloring, and all of that, how that's changed through digitization. We also talked a little bit about the whole phenomena of the Marvel Comics universe, the MCU universe, and then versus the DC universe, and the way in which these types of, if you will, comic book stories and products have been attached with this kind of a cultural juggernaut of Marvel Comics. We also thought of how comics have been attached to camp as well. And I'm thinking in particular of the Batman television show and the different types of kind of campy set designs. And we also talked a bit about how that touched upon theater design and set design. And then that, of course, led us to also talk a little bit about the small screen versus the big screen, television shows versus blockbuster movies. And we also talked about this notion of serialization, and how comics, how that serialization that's very present in comic books, in paper comic books, translated, if you will, into TV and film. And also, I think we ended on kind of a discussion of how, with so many superhero comic books, having characters wearing basically spandex or basically bathing suits, that there's this whole sexualization component to superheroes and to the body, to muscles and to beauty and to the perfect form, that could also be discussed in a course about comics. But certainly we thought that a course like this should have the subtitle of comics and culture, and the subtitle would be something like deviance and regulation, something to do with prohibition, deviance, normalcy, and degeneration. All of these concepts should figure in, if you will, the shaping of a course about comics. Okay, so then I'll stop there. I'll just stop that share, and I'll just pause the video a bit. Okay, so I've fired up Bing, and so I'll share that screen with you here. So here's Bing, and if you're not familiar with Bing, Bing is the search engine for Microsoft Edge. What you can do, just like you would in ChatGPT, you would go into up here on the right beside Microsoft Bing, you would click on Chat. That then fires up, if you will, this interface called Welcome to the New Bing, which is Bing Chat. And here it is. It says, ask me anything. And I've pre-written a prompt. And so I'll just paste that prompt in. If you can see here, I'll just enlarge that. You are a university professor and academic researcher. The notes below are from a brainstorming session to develop a cultural criminology course that centers on comics and culture with a focus on deviance, regulation, and resistance. Please read these notes and organize the ideas into a more formal structure. Please recommend or suggest a university course syllabus using these materials. The syllabus should describe a 13-week long course. Okay, so let's go back into my Word document. And I just had read this verbatim, kind of stream of consciousness, I read from my notes. And what we'll do is we'll just paste those notes and see what happens. I've not tried this before. I mean, I've tried it a little bit before with something else, but not to this extent. So I will be quite surprised or interested to see what it does. I hope I don't exceed the word length. So let's paste that in. It did actually go to it's go beyond the word length. So I don't know if all of the things that I dictated are going to fit in there, but let's see what it can do. Okay, so actually, I think it's actually generated the answer, but I didn't scroll down. So there it is. Yeah. So there's what I pasted in, and I did select more creative so that it could be more creative in creating the syllabus. So that's everything that I pasted. It cut off a little bit. I don't think it was the entire document, which was much longer here. So I think the last part got cut off. It just kind of it went beyond the allowed 4,000 word limit or 4,000 character limit. So here you go. Here is the hello, this is Bing. I can help you organize your ideas into a more formal structure for a cultural criminology course syllabus. Here are possible outlines. Okay, so here we go. Cultural criminology. The course explores the intersections of comics, culture, crime, and deviance, and resistance from a cultural criminological perspective. It examines how comics as a medium and a genre can illuminate various aspects of crime and deviance in different historical, geographical, and social contexts. That's interesting because I think I intimated. There was a suggestion of that, but I'm certainly those were not my words. So now it already, just even in that first sentence, it calls into question how much is it collaging with other syllabi that is looked at online, and how much of this, if you will, more creative kind of re-editing and, if you will, recollaging of my stream of consciousness reading of these notes into a syllabus are actually my own, if you will, ideas, or the ideas that grew out of our brainstorming session. Because it does feel like there's now a third person in the room, which is Bing, right? It also analyzes how comics can challenge or reinforce dominant narratives and representations of crime, justice, and social control. The course covers topics such as the history and development of comics, the diversity and specificity of comic cultures, the political economy and regulation of comics, the subcultural and aesthetic dimensions of comics, the role of comics in social movements and activism, and the impact of digitization and globalization of comics. That's interesting. I'm not so sure in the reading of notes that there was ever the mention of social movements and activism, but perhaps by mentioning words like perhaps political economy, regulation, criminalization, so on and so forth, maybe it it somehow started to look for, if you will, other documents or texts in its database that it was in a line, I guess, with the tone of this of these stream of consciousness notes. Course objectives, okay, it's kind of interesting, very boilerplate. I think many colleagues and if you're a university instructor, you will be familiar with this idea of course objectives, demonstrating, identifying. Yeah, these are very common ways of framing so-called course objectives. Course requirements, okay, that's interesting. Evaluation, that's interesting. It's already telling us what types of projects and assignments could be, if you will, suggested. The course schedule is tentative. Let's see, the first week. Well, what is cultural criminology? What are comics? Yeah, that's actually a very good topic for a first day. Farrell et al., Cultural Criminology and Imitation, Chapter 1. We'll look at, I won't do that right now, but let's look up the citations to see if they exist, because that's one of the huge, I think, criticisms of generative AI, that it confabulates and makes up, if you will, false, non-existent citations. So let's look that up to see if those exist. History of comics, okay. And then another reading, chapter 1 from this book. Genres of comics, superheroes, undergrounds, realism and beyond. Oh, that's a very evocative title for week 3. And then a citation, comic cultures, North America, Europe, Asia, and beyond. That's interesting. Political economy of comics, production, distribution, consumption, also very, very cogent. Regulation of comics, censorship, criminalization, and moral panic. Subculture of comics, identity, style, and resistance. Aesthetics of comics, expression, emotion, and sensation. Activism of comics, oh, that's interesting. Digitization, globalization, and then conclusion, and then final presentations. That's not too bad. That's quite interesting. Let's pick one of these topics, and yeah, let's pick this one. Genres of comics, superheroes, undergrounds, realism, and beyond. I'm going to quote them. And I'm going to say, because it says, ask me anything. You wrote, can you please provide more detailed explanation for this week 3 presentation? Please provide a step-by-step explanation of this week's topic and readings. Let's see what it says. Okay, so it searched actually for, oh, that's interesting. So it searched for the very text that it suggested, which was the Duncan and Smith text, which I'm not familiar with. But it makes me hopeful that it does exist. Learning, okay, all right, sure. You can explain the historical and cultural context. You're going to define things, you analyze them. Okay, here's the lecture outline. What is a genre? How are comics classified? How did they evolve over time? Okay, and then the reading assignment. So interesting. It provides a little summary, a small abstract, right? This chapter provides an overview of the main comic genres. Blah, blah, blah. That's good. I'm gonna let's look that up. Yeah. Let's see if that does exist. I'll look that up in a second. And then even provides discussion questions. What are some of the criteria? Blah, blah, blah. Choose a comic genre you're familiar with, interest. Oh, interesting. Okay. So that's quite interesting. Okay, so I'll just go into Bing and then I will paste that in. I'm sorry. So just paste this in. Fine. Yes, there we go. The power of comics. Sorry about that. I was not familiar how to use Bing. Yeah, so let's go back. It said that it was the power of comics, history and form, chapter 4. And what are the authors? Duncan and Smith from 2015. It's interesting. I guess maybe that's a more recent volume or edition. Here in Google Books, it's citing that, well, actually, yeah, that there's a publication in 2019. So I don't doubt that it exists. It does look like this book does exist, but I can't be totally sure of the citation. I think it is correct. It did cite chapter 4, so chapter 4 is the comic book industry. Yeah, so yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that is the comic book industry or is it the genres. Yeah, we're talking about genres. So yeah, I think if it's the comic book industry, chapter 4, which is 85, I think that's wrong. Let's see, where's okay, let's go back. Anyways, okay, so I think maybe it is an existing citation, the Duncan and Smith, The Power of Comics, that exists. However, it's cited chapter 4 from Power of Comics, which is more about the industry of comics and not so much this section, which is about genres, if you will, the genres of comic books. So that's perhaps not correct. But anyways, I'll stop sharing this screen. So that was just a short test. Let me summarize, I think, what I was trying to do and maybe what has been revealed, I think, by this experiment. Here are some notes that I have. I read them out and I dictated the notes into basically Word. I copied those dictated notes from Word and pasted them into Bing, and I asked Bing to help me reorganize those words, those brainstorming ideas into a syllabus. And it did a very, very good job, I think, except for, again, I think there's this question of whether the citations are correct. The book certainly exists, but I'm not so sure if that chapter existed for that section. And then when I did ask it to give me a little bit, and I just picked 1 week, week 3, if it could elaborate on what would be discussed or what would be, if you will, the learning objectives, and if you will, the overview of that week. It did a very good job in the sense of describing the this idea of genres and the origins of these genres. So I think the discussion questions, the reading assignment, the lecture outline, the learning objectives, all of those are quite good. So I could have, of course, asked it to give, if you will, a more detailed explanation for every week. And that would be, I think, quite an interesting jumping off point, because we would have gone from a blank page, my discussion with my colleagues about this course, with a kind of almost I guess, a fictitious draft of a potential course, right? And so I think that is quite useful and quite powerful and quite fascinating in the sense that now you do have, if you will, this almost executive assistant that's able to help you draft ideas and perhaps iterate or help, if you will, get over that initial barrier of, say, the blank page, right? Here are just some, notes that I read from. It was able to fill in some of those blanks. So that's another thing. When you use something like a generative AI, basically executive assistant, who's helping you fill in some of the blanks and create some of the connective tissue for, say, in this case, a course syllabus. It could be anything. It could be a novel, or it could be an essay, right? it can fill in those blanks. I think it's quite useful, right? In the sense that it does feel like the writing and the presentation and the tone of its presentation is all is very, very useful. I think it's not, there's not a wrong tone or a wrong kind of representation of my re-representation of the ideas that I gave it. Some of it, I think it's backfilling with its own ideas. But by and large, I would think just given this short kind of 10-minute test, I think it's very powerful, and it's something to definitely think about. So that's quite a lot of food for thought. So final thought would be, yeah, I think Bing Chat is very powerful for recombining and re-rolling your words and turning those words into a more complete and better structured form. The question is, are those ideas all your own? That's the $64,000 question. Or is it that now you're working with, if you will, a co-author, and if you don't cite that co-author, are you plagiarizing, if you will, from that generative AI co-author? Anyways, this generates more questions than answers. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed that experiment. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.